In the dim light of a medieval monastery, a young monk named Eadric sat alone in his cell, his eyes heavy with a strange, unshakable weariness. It was not the kind of tiredness that comes from a hard day's work. It was something deeper, more insidious. Eadric's mind felt as if it were wrapped in a thick fog, making every thought sluggish and every task seem insurmountable. He found himself staring at the pages of his prayer book, reading the same line over and over, unable to focus. This feeling, known as Acedia, was more than just laziness. It was a spiritual malaise that gnawed at the soul, leaving a void where faith and purpose should have been. Eadric's heart ached with a deep, unexplainable sadness. He felt a constant urge to abandon his duties, to give up the monastic life, and to retreat into the comfort of his own isolation. Acedia was not a new concept. The Desert Fathers, like John Cassian, had written about it as early as the 4th century. They described it as a kind of spiritual fever, a disease that attacked the soul at regular intervals, leaving the monk feeling enfeebled and unable to resist its pull. Cassian's remedy was simple but demanding: manual labor. He believed that physical work could drive away the demons of Acedia and restore the soul's vigor. However, as the centuries passed, the understanding of Acedia evolved. By the time of Gregory the Great, Acedia had transformed into something more complex. Gregory listed its many forms, including malice, rancor, pusillanimity, cowardice, despair, slothfulness in keeping the commandments, and a wandering mind that was drawn to illicit thoughts. These were not just symptoms of laziness. They were signs of a deeper spiritual crisis. As the Middle Ages progressed, the focus on Acedia shifted from the isolated monastic life to the broader community. Theologians and preachers began to pay more attention to the external characteristics of sloth, rather than its psychological roots. This change reflected a broader shift in Western theology, moving from the specific challenges of desert asceticism to the more general concerns of pastoral care. Despite this evolution, the older ascetic and clerical conceptions of sloth persisted. For example, Alexander of Hales, a 13th century theologian, placed sloth under the category of anima, which referred to the soul as it pertained to the body. This blending of the spiritual and the corporeal was also reflected in Aquinas' definition of acedia, as the negligence of a man who declines to acquire spiritual goods on account of the attendant labor. By the later medieval period, sloth had become more closely associated with the body. It was often depicted as a temptation of the flesh, alongside sins like lechery and gluttony. In a 15th century Middle English sermon, sloth was described as one of the sins that tempts through the flesh. This shift in emphasis from soul to body brought sloth into the realm of the humors, the medieval understanding of the body's balance. Sloth was often linked with the phlegmatic humor, which was characterized by a cold and moist nature. The phlegmatic person was described as lazy, slow, and dull, traits that closely mirrored the symptoms of sloth. In medical texts, sloth was associated with a variety of ailments, including quartan fever, palsy, leprosy, and gout. These diseases were seen as both metaphorical and material manifestations of sloth. One of the most striking associations was with the feet. In medieval sermons, sloth was often depicted as a sin that bound the feet, preventing the slothful from moving forward in their spiritual journey. This symbolic image was rooted in the idea that the slothful were restrained from action, both physically and spiritually. The feet, as the body parts most involved in movement, became a powerful metaphor for the inaction caused by sloth. The eyes of the slothful were also described as sleepy or obstructed, reflecting the mental and spiritual lethargy that accompanied the sin. Langland's character Sloth, for example, had two slimed aeon, suggesting eyes clouded by sleep and inaction. This imagery emphasized the idea that sloth not only affected the body, but also clouded the mind, making it difficult to see the path to spiritual growth. The tension between disease and sin was particularly pronounced in the depiction of sloth. Theologians like Aquinas saw acedia as a type of tristitia, or sorrow, but a special kind of sorrow that was rooted in the will. While sorrow could be a natural emotion, acedia was a sin because it involved a willful rejection of spiritual goods. This rejection was seen as a movement away from God, a dangerous path that could lead to spiritual death. In the end, the medieval understanding of sloth was complex and multifaceted. It was a sin that affected both the body and the soul, a condition that required both spiritual and physical remedies. For Eadric, sitting alone in his cell, the battle against Acedia was a daily struggle. But he knew that with the help of his community, the guidance of his faith, and the discipline of manual labor, he could overcome the devil's trap and find the strength to carry on. In the world of medieval literature, the sin of gluttony is a big deal. It's all about eating and drinking, but it's not just about having too much. It's about how and when you eat, and what you eat. Gluttony can make people act in silly ways, and it can even make them sick. Back in the old days, a wise man named Cashin said that gluttony is the first of all sins. He thought it was the most important because we can't live without food. Food is a basic need, but it can also be a big temptation. Another wise man, Gregory the Great, had a different idea. He thought gluttony should be last on the list of sins. But many people after him still thought it was a big problem. So what exactly is gluttony? It's not just about eating too much. It's about eating at the wrong times, eating fancy or dainty foods, and even drinking too much. These bad habits can lead to other problems like being too happy in a silly way, being a clown, being dirty, talking too much, and not thinking clearly. The tricky thing about gluttony is that food is important for staying healthy, but too much of a good thing can be bad. That's why people in the Middle Ages spent a lot of time figuring out what was healthy and what wasn't. They believed that eating and drinking could either help you or hurt you. One of the big worries was that gluttony could make people sick. They thought that eating too much or eating the wrong things could mess up your body's natural balance. This balance was called humors, and they believed that if your humors were out of whack, you could get sick. For example, if someone ate too much rich food, they might get a stomachache or feel sluggish. If they drank too much, they might get a headache. Even eating at the wrong times, like late at night, could make them feel bad. These problems weren't just about feeling uncomfortable. They could also make people less able to do their daily tasks or even their spiritual duties. To avoid these problems, people were told to eat in moderation. They were encouraged to eat simple, healthy foods, and to eat at regular times. This was seen as a way to keep their bodies and minds in good shape. But it wasn't just about staying healthy. Gluttony was also seen as a sin because it could lead to other bad behaviors. When people were too focused on food, they might neglect their duties, like going to church or helping others. They might also become lazy or greedy, always wanting more. In the stories and sermons of the Middle Ages, there are many examples of people who struggled with gluttony. Some were monks who found it hard to resist the temptation of good food. Others were regular people who ate too much and ended up in trouble. These stories were meant to teach people to be careful and to think about the consequences of their actions. One of the most famous stories is about a monk who thought he was sick when he was really just lazy. He would pretend to be too tired or too weak to get out of bed for prayers. But in reality, he just didn't want to do the work. This is a classic example of how gluttony can be used as an excuse for not doing what you should. Another story talks about a man who ate too much rich food and ended up with a bad stomach. He thought it was just a normal illness, but it was really the result of his gluttony. This story shows how gluttony can make you physically sick, which can then affect your spiritual life. In the end, gluttony was seen as a dangerous sin because it could lead to so many other problems. It was something that people had to be very careful about, both for their health and for their soul. The message was clear: eat well, but don't overdo it. In the world of the Middle Ages, the sin of gluttony was viewed through the lens of both religion and medicine. For English Augustinian mystic Walter Hilton, who lived until 1396, eating was seen as a natural and necessary act, much like taking medicine to cure an illness. He believed that when hunger is a sickness, eating is the medicine to heal it. However, Hilton also warned that when eating turns into a desire for pleasure and becomes a willful indulgence, it becomes a sin. This idea is echoed in the medieval poem Piers Plowman, where the phrase "measure is medicine" suggests that balance is key to both physical and spiritual health. The poet complicates this idea by pointing out that what the body desires isn't always good for the spirit, and what is valuable to the soul isn't always necessary for the body. This highlights the complexity of balancing physical and spiritual well-being through diet. During the later Middle Ages, theologians and writers were influenced by dietary texts from Greece and the Middle East. These texts emphasized moderation, which aligned with Christian teachings. Medicine and religion shared many common rules about behavior, especially when it came to eating. Doctors often prescribed diets to treat illnesses, and they recommended specific eating habits to prevent diseases. For example, Queen Isabel's dietary guidelines advised how to keep different parts of the body healthy, including what to eat, when to eat, and how much to eat. Overeating, drinking too much, and late-night feasting were all considered harmful. The desert monks of early Christianity also had guidelines for eating. The monk Moses, as recorded by Cassian, discussed how to measure the right amount of food and choose the right types of food, such as beans, vegetables, and small portions of bread. However, Moses also warned that excessive fasting could be just as dangerous as overeating, leading to mental and physical fatigue. In the later Middle Ages, texts like the Dietary by John Lydgate provided general advice on healthy eating, while others offered personalized diets based on individual need. The sense of taste was particularly important, and eating at the right time, such as noon, was recommended for better digestion. However, these texts also emphasize the importance of personal judgment in choosing foods that align with spiritual goals, avoiding those that lead to excessive desire and distract from devotion to God. Both religious and medical texts agreed that a proper diet was essential for maintaining not only physical health, but also mental clarity and ethical behavior. Gluttony was seen as a major sin because it could lead to physical illnesses and impair one's ability to think and speak clearly. For example, overindulging in rich foods and drinks was believed to turn a man's mind upside down and make him less capable of rational thought. The physical effects of gluttony were often described in vivid terms. Gluttons were said to produce foul-smelling substances and suffer from various illnesses, such as vomiting, indigestion, and gout. Some texts even compared the effects of excessive drinking to being poisoned, with the venom of drink spreading through the body and causing evil speech. The mouth, full of treason and treachery, was seen as a reflection of the glutton's inner corruption. Symbolically, gluttony was linked to the original sin of Adam and Eve, who were punished with bodily illnesses for their transgression. Pastoral writers often use these symbolic connections to emphasize the importance of moderation and self-control. They warned that gluttony could lead to a variety of physical and mental ailments, including fever, which was seen as a physical manifestation of the spiritual fever caused by excessive desire. The relationship between gluttony and speech was particularly significant. Excessive eating and drinking were thought to affect the brain, making it harder for a person to think clearly and speak coherently. This was often described using the metaphor of fumes rising from the stomach to the brain, causing drowsiness, confusion, and even stuttering. These physical effects were seen as a direct result of the body being overloaded with food and drink. In the end, the medieval understanding of gluttony was deeply intertwined with both medical and religious beliefs. While the body needed food to survive, indulging in excess was seen as a sin that could lead to physical and spiritual decay. The balance between eating to satisfy natural needs and avoiding overindulgence was a central theme in both medical and religious teachings, emphasizing the importance of moderation and self-control in maintaining a healthy and virtuous life. In the medieval world, people had a very specific way of looking at health and the body, which was deeply tied to their understanding of morality. They believed that what you ate and how you ate it could not only affect your physical health, but also your soul. Gluttony, or eating too much, was seen as a major sin that could lead to all sorts of problems, both in the body and the mind. Medieval doctors and writers thought that when you ate too much, your stomach and liver couldn't properly digest the food. This undigested food would then turn bad inside your body, like food that goes bad if you leave it out too long. They believed this bad food could poison your blood, causing fevers and other illnesses. Some of these illnesses, like scrofula and lupus, were thought to be caused by the body's inability to process the excess food properly. A famous surgeon named Guy de Chauliac even said that gluttony and poor self-control were the main causes of these kinds of health problems. This idea of gluttony affecting the body was also reflected in religious writing. Pastoral writers, who were responsible for teaching people about their faith, often talked about how overeating could harm both the body and the soul. For example, a 14th century writer named Richard Lavenham wrote that eating too much could waste and rot a person's body, leading to long illnesses and a bad death. He explained that when the body can't properly digest the food, it causes all sorts of problems. Another writer, the compiler of a book called Jacob's Well, used cooking and boiling as a way to describe how bad diet and indigestion could cause illness. He said that when people tell lies or swear false oaths, it's like a pot of boiling water that spills over, spreading bad stuff everywhere. This idea was used to show how bad words and bad actions could come from a body that was already full of unhealthy things. The connection between food and speech was also important. Writers like John Merck, who gave advice to priests, said that using bad language or telling dirty jokes was like poison for a priest's mouth. This poison could hurt the priest's own soul, and also harm anyone who heard it. On the other hand, good words and teachings were seen as a kind of medicine that could heal both the body and the soul. One writer even encouraged people to take in good teachings like they were taking in good food, to nourish their souls. Gluttony was also linked to certain body types. In medieval medicine, people's bodies were thought to be made up of 4 humors or fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Each humor was associated with different qualities and could affect a person's health and behavior. For example, children were often seen as naturally gluttonous because their bodies were thought to be cold and moist, which made them want to eat more to warm up. However, some writers like Robert Ripon explained that not all gluttony was natural. Some people ate too much not because of their body type, but because they wanted to satisfy their own desire. In the same way, medieval astronomers and theologians sometimes linked the sin of gluttony to the moon. They believed that the moon's influence on the tides was like the body's digestive system, which could be overwhelmed by too much food and drink. This idea was used to show how excess could flood the body and soul with bad things. To cure gluttony, many religious texts recommended abstinence or fasting. Fasting was seen as a way to control the body and the soul, and it was often done at specific times of the year to balance the body's humors. For example, in the spring, people would fast to control their blood, and in the winter, they would fast to control their phlegm. Some writers, like John Merck, even recommended fasting in certain seasons to help control specific sins, like lust or gluttony. However, fasting was not always easy, and some people tried to avoid it by claiming they were too weak or sick. But the church was wise to these excuses and recognized that some people, like pregnant women or the very old, might need to eat more to stay healthy. The key was to find a balance. Fasting was good for the soul, but too much fasting could be harmful. Despite the emphasis on abstinence and fasting, some writers warned that doing these things for the wrong reasons could be a sin. For example, if someone fasted only to look good or to feel healthy, it wasn't seen as a true act of faith. The goal was to do these things to please God and to improve one's spiritual life, not just to feel better physically. In the end, the medieval understanding of gluttony and its effects on the body and soul shows how closely linked health and morality were in that time. Eating in moderation and taking care of one's body were seen as important not just for physical health, but also for spiritual well-being. This idea of balance and moderation is something that can still be valuable to us today, as we continue to think about how our choices affect both our bodies and our mind. Lechery, the sin of excessive and wrongful sexual desire, has been a topic of much discussion and concern throughout medieval literature and culture. It's a sin that, like gluttony, often intertwines with health and the body. Medieval thinkers explored the nature of lechery, its effects, and how to resist it. In the early days, thinkers like Augustine argued that physical changes, such as fasting, couldn't conquer lust. He believed that such claims might be signs of pride. However, other texts, from Cassion's Conferences to the Fasciculus Morum, suggested that reducing unnecessary food and drink could help control lust. Some practical tips included drinking less water, avoiding strong and spiced wines, and even pouring water over oneself. William of Ockham, a prominent medieval philosopher, took a different view. He argued that people shouldn't be judged as virtuous, just for following medical advice. Instead, virtue comes from rational choices, not from the natural or artificial inclinations of the body. Occam noted that physicians could weaken lust by cooling the body, but actions that heat the body can increase it. Lechery was a significant concern for medieval theologians and moralists. They discussed the culpability of nocturnal emissions and the medical need to cleanse the body of excess sperm. Lechery is often ranked as one of the last or penultimate sins of the flesh, alongside gluttony. Despite the serious nature of lechery, many writers delved into its details, sometimes in a way that seems prurient. However, pastoral writers were also cautious about the dangers of detailing sins too explicitly, as it could lead to temptation. Lechery was often associated with the decay and decomposition of the flesh. For example, in Templum Domini, lechery is described as licking over the flesh, causing it to stink. John Gower compared lechery to leprosy, noting how both can corrupt and stink, drawing on medieval ideas of contagion. The role of pleasure in sexual desire was a central topic. While pleasure in sex was not inherently bad, theologians debated its necessity for procreation. Albertus Magnus argued that pleasure was essential for species survival, as it motivates the hard work of parenting. However, the idea of prelepsarian before the fall conception without desire was also discussed. Bridget of Sweden wrote that in this ideal state, conception was facilitated by divine love, not lust. In medieval humoral theory, lechery was linked to blood sanguis. The hot and moist sanguine complexion, typical of adolescence, was thought to predispose one to lust. Rapon's sermon explained that while natural physical inclinations weren't shameful, the deliberate provocation of lust was. As people aged, their bodies cooled, and so did their lust. This cooling with age was seen as one of the few benefits of growing older. Lechery, with its complex interplay of physical, moral, and spiritual dimensions, continues to be a rich topic for medieval literature and culture. From the detailed discussions of its nature and effects to the practical advice on how to resist it, lechery remains a sin that challenges the boundaries of human desire and moral responsibility. Understanding lechery in the medieval context provides insights into the broader cultural and religious values of the time.